This is Waldo Vanek speaking. I'm at the site of the mill being constructed at the lower end of Mill Street, or at the lower end of Main Street as we used to call it, by the dam, which is replacing the mill which was taken off of the area here in the 1950s and is being built as a reproduction by a group of Frankenmuth citizens who are loyal historians and who want these landmarks replaced and as nearly as possible as they looked a few years ago.
About 25 years ago, when the old mill was here, and before they tore it down, I called up Bruce Berkman, who was at that time head of the international breweries who owned Frankenmuth. At that time, they were brewing Frankenmuth beer in New York, and he was the manager. I asked Bruce if we could buy the old mill when I heard they was going to tear it down. And he said, no, it's an eyesore. It had to be removed. And of course, the mill was torn down, and in the back of my mind, I always had that someday maybe we should build the old mill again. At that time, of course, I didn't have any idea that we would reconstruct it as large as we did. I just thought we would put a little kind of replica of a mill here because we always had the dam. When Al Nickless was retired and Mr. Blakey retired and Winnie Kern, we drove around to different mill sites to see what we could do. And then we finally found an old mill up in West Branch, very similar to the one that was in Frankenmuth. And we were able to buy the milling equipment that we needed for a price of $15,000. Now that was the beginning then, and then we said, okay, the man give us 1 year, we could leave the equipment there, and then after a year we still didn't have enough members to reconstruct the mill. And so finally, with the help of Frank Ribmiller and the bank, and with their lawyers and Mr. Schwartz, we started a limited partnership, which meant that we needed 22 members, $15,000 apiece, $5,000 a year for a 3-year period. It took us about a year to get organized. After we got organized, also set up a deal up at the Frankenmuth Historical Association so that those people who did not want to invest, but they could then donate money to the Historical Association, which was then loaned to the Nickless Hubinger mill. And when we got started, it was Al's idea to build a store first, and then could we use that store as a kind of a working center for the rest of the mill. And then we got a lease from the city. This property is owned by the city for $1 a year, 99-year lease. And so things started popping up. We bought the old church stores from St. Lawrence and converted them. They're here. Mr. Reinbold, who had some of the flooring from the original mill, made a donation. And other people made donations to the Historical Association to get this project going. And when you drive down Main Street, it's really a beautiful structure. It looks like it really belongs here. I must say, I think it's nicer now, the way the building is, than when the original building was here. Historical mills, because of the low profit margin, get kind of run down, and they don't plow too much money into aesthetic values of their building. I'm really happy that we are as far as we are. I think the store will open up in June, and the mill maybe a year from now. I think all these people who have invested money and donated money are really going to be proud after we get this building done.
I want to catch the chief engineer here, Winfred Kern. He has a man working with him. What's his name, Winfred?
No, come.
They're varnishing the spouts or the
elevators.
Elevators for the grain, which will move downward from the top of the mill down through the various grainings. Is that right there?
Yeah, that's the way
and,
it works.
They're putting a beautiful varnish coat on these.
Yeah, we washed them first and cleaned them, and now we're going to varnish them. See?
Yeah.
When Tiny and Al Nickless and a few others had the idea of trying to restore the old mill down by the river, why, I consider it a wonderful opportunity for me to become involved, and it's surely been an awful lot of fun for me. I'm on the board of directors together with Charlie Nickless and Tiny Zender. The three of us comprise the board of directors. I'm really tickled the way the building is shaping up. I think Red Beach has really caught the feeling of what we were trying to create here. The minute you walk into the building, it reminds me, and I have seen many, many old mills around this country and Europe, it reminds me immediately of an old flour mill. And even though it's a new building, he has created that old look. I think it's an important part of Frankenmuth's heritage that we're trying to restore here, because right after the Hubinger family got a lumber mill started so that the settlers could cut trees and create lumber to build their houses, They also established the flour mill and grist mill so they could grind feed for their cattle and convert the wheat into flour. It is truly a part of our original history here in Frankenmuth, and I'm surely glad that those supporters that supported it, not only physically but also financially, were of a mind to help create this thing, and we're certainly grateful. The actual Star of the West Milling Company was founded in 1870. However, there were milling activities in Frankenmuth before then, started by the Hubinger family. The mill that we're now talking about, the Nickless Hubinger mill, the original flour mill on that site was known as Frankenmuth Milling Company until about 1921, and they were competitors of Star of the West Milling Company until 1921. They were owned by a group of local businessmen. I think Adolf Nickless was one of their office employees. But in 1921, Frankenmuth Milling Company decided to sell out to Star of the West, and it's been owned by Star. It was owned by Star of the West until 1956, when Star of the West sold the property to Frankenmuth Brewing Company. The actual building that some of us in our generation remember on the site was built in 1910 down by the dam on this site that we're now building the Nickless Hubinger mill. And that building was built in 1910 right after fire destroyed the original building on that site. There's pictures around town of the original building. It was pretty much on the same footings and so on, but it had a different shaped roof. We have pictures around of the original mill that stood on that site that burnt down in 1910. The dam that you see there was at first an earthen dam covered with wood. In the middle 1920s, Star of the West undertook to convert it from a wooden earthen dam to a concrete dam as we see it today. We have various pictures in our files showing that work in progress. Some way or other they held up the water towards the east of the dam and some way poured concrete over the existing wooden earthen dam. And that's what we still see today. That was done in the middle 1920s. We had to repair it a lot when we used to own it. I worked here when Star of the West owned it, and it was our responsibility as a company to maintain it. And we had to put a lot of work into it every year back in those days. But about in 1956, someplace in that area, Star of the West sold the dam to the city for, I think it was $1. Since that time, it's been the city's responsibility to keep it repaired. However, I've been on the council just about all that time, and it didn't seem to be much of a problem for the city. I guess maybe we fixed it pretty good before we gave it to the city. That dam is historic as are all dams. It's on the law of the books of the state of Michigan, and it cannot be eliminated or removed or destroyed without another law being passed, because it would create many, many problems upstream if we were to remove this dam. I'd just like to, for the record, say that we were so fortunate to have had Al Nickless with us as long as he was with us, because he had an engineering and creative mind, and in the planning stages and in the designing stages he was with us. The last week that he was with us, why, we went through the final drawings with Red Beach, and the final approvals were accepted as recommended by Al, and so we were lucky to have had him with us this long. But it's certainly a sad thing that he couldn't have been allowed to be with us long enough to at least see the completion of this project that he loved so dearly.
Greetings, I'm Dick Kraft, and I'm one of the people in town that was involved with the reconstruction of this historic Nickless Hubinger mill. And it's historic and important to Frankenmuth's history because it represents one of the earliest industries along the Cache River in Frankenmuth. The original mill burnt down at this site, and it was rebuilt and remained an operating flour mill until 1956. After that time, it was torn down and the site was empty for some years until local folks decided to reconstruct it and have it as a historic landmark. So it's an operating mill. It has the ability to produce flour, and we'd now like to take you through the mill and show you how the mill actually operates. We're here at the Nickless Hubinger flour mill in Frankenmuth, Michigan. This mill is a restoration of a mill that was torn down here in 1956. The original location housed the mill in the middle 1800s, but that mill burned down in about 1908, and in 1910 a new mill was built, which was here till 1956. So this was an effort to capture the history of milling in Frankenmuth. Right here we're standing in the location of where the process actually starts. The clean wheat is brought here and it's dumped in this hopper that's in front of me. That is a very important part of the milling process, the cleaning of the wheat. The wheat has to be scrubbed externally. It has to be subjected to vacuum and air to get all the dust and stuff off so that only clean wheat enters the milling process. After the wheat has been cleaned, it gets elevated to the top of the mill, up to the 4th floor, and it comes on down to the system. The first actual processing of the wheat takes place here in what we call the first break roll stand. What we have is we have the wheat coming through a scale, and it drops down into here, and there's some rolls inside that run towards each other. And these rolls have a corrugated surface on them, with one roll running faster than the other. The objective being we want to tear the wheat kernels apart. We don't want to grind the outside of the wheat berry into the flour. So that's what we do here. After it goes through that first break roll, drops down here, and we can take a sample of it and feel it. And from here it goes on up to the 3rd floor where it goes through the sifter and where the flour separation process commences. So each side of this roll stand does a different job. The other side of this stand has got different corrugations of rolls, and it works with a different product that we'll talk about a little bit later. We have, in this mill, 4 of these roll stands, which means we've got 8 different processes because we do 2 processes in each stand. You'll notice these are all wooden spouts in an old mill. This is known as a mechanical mill, which is how we used to do things years ago. But nowadays we use pneumatic spouting and so on. But note the workmanship in here, these diamond spouts and so on. Took some real skilled millwrights to make these spouts. We're now following the process through the mill, and we have just left the first break roll stand where the wheat is ground for the first time. It is elevated from that level up to the top of the mill, and we bring it down here to the sifter. Now the sifter is a very integral part of the milling process because here's where we do all the separations of the flours and the bran and the midge. What we have here is, if you'll notice on the other side, we have 8 different products coming into this sifter on the other side of this sifter. There are 8 sections in here, and the product that we introduce over there is ground wheat, and that's flour, bran, and midge all mixed together. So our job here is to bring it across here on silks and separate those. The far end of this sifter has got the finest silks in it so that the flour can go through those silks. And as we come towards this end, the silks are coarser, so the most coarse material can go through. If you'll notice, we come in with 1 product in each section, and we exit here with anywhere from 3 to 5 products on this end of the sifter. One of those products is finished flour. The other 2 or 3 products, whatever the case might be, is coarse material that goes on for further processing. And we repeat this process until we've got all the flour removed from the wheat kernel, which is about 45 pounds of flour for every 60 pounds of wheat, 75% extraction. So this sifter is very important for the milling process, and this is called a plan sifter, which is a sort of sifters that were used into the early 1900s, but have not been really in commercial use for at least 50 years because we now have a different type of sifter than we used to have in those days. So this sifting takes place obviously all the time that the mill runs, and this sifter, by the way, is not connected to the floor. It's totally suspended from overhead so that it can have this free movement. In the milling process, it's an ongoing challenge to keep separating the flour from the bran and from the mids, bearing in mind that the main object here is to add as much flour as we can. One of the machines we use to make this happen is this purifier machine. That's what that's called. And what we do here, we introduce the raw material or the ground product on this end of the machine, and we have vibrating sifters that move the product towards this end. Again, we have fine silks on the beginning side of this machine, and as we get towards the tail end, we get coarser screens in there. So we make a number of separations here, and one of these separations is finished flour. So this is called a purifier. Now then, another machine that we use in the process of milling flour is a machine called a reel. This is another machine that helps us make these many separations we have to make in the milling process. In this mill, we probably have 20 different products in motion at any given time, all the time. And now in this reel, the way this works is, this is a tumbling reel in here. That's why the machine is called a reel. And it's got a cover of silk on it. And the flour is introduced, or the product is introduced on this end, and it works its way towards the other end. And as it's tumbling here, we hope for the flour to fall through the silk, and then that becomes finished flour, and the product that discharges above the silk, it doesn't go through the silk, goes on to the next roll stand for further processing. In the process of restoring this mill, I might mention at this point of our tour, we had the help of many, many very talented craftsmen to help us restore the machinery back to displayable condition and usable condition. And here's a good example of the work we had to do to get it from how we found these old machines to their present state. Here you're seeing a machine that we haven't done much work on. And here you see a machine that was in much worse condition than that, but it's really a lot of craftsmanship in here. And I need to mention the most skilled craftsman we had here was a man by the name of Winnie Kern. He worked in here for several years restoring all of this. This machine is called a bran duster. And here again, the bran, which is the outer layer of the wheat kernel, has flour clinging to it. Our job is to remove the flour from the bran because that's really what we're after. And this machine helps us do that. The product enters the machine here, and there's a reel in here that turns with a screen on it. And here again, we want to we want to be abrasive to the bran so the flour falls off through the screens. So this is called a bran duster, and it helps that process. I just point out this little piece of wood here that Mr. Kern made to fit this machine, and so that it would look like the original machine. And I think it's an excellent example of the good work that Mr. Kern has done for us here. So this is another machine that helps us get all the flour out of the wheat kernel. This is the flour bin. This is where the end product ends up just before it goes into the packer. And the packer we'll see a little bit later because it's on the main floor just directly underneath here. So this is where the end product gets stored before we pack it. When you're in the flour milling business, one of your enemies is dust, because when you really think about it, flour is dust because it all has to go through a silk as fine as a hose, a stocking. So dust is always a problem, and so we have to spend a lot of time and effort to have suction on every machine in the building to try and pick up all the dust that we can so it doesn't end up on the outside of the machines or on the floor. And as we pick up that dust, we have to do something with it. So what we do is we blow that dust into what's called a star filter. And that's what we're looking at here. The process is the flour gets blown, the dust gets blown in here, and then the dust settles down by gravity into these socks. These are fabric stockings. And then these keep turning, as you see, And at the very top, there's some hammers. You can hear the sound of them right now. And they pound on here like this, and to loosen up the dust that was accumulated here, we drop that down into the center, into a screw conveyor. We bring the dust back in to the milling system, and it ends up as feed. So this is the old Star filter, which we don't use anymore because they're too dusty, but that's how it was done for many years. In the milling process, a lot of elevation has to take place because, as you've noticed by now perhaps, we grind this wheat and it becomes many different pieces before its finally end product. We would have, as I mentioned earlier, probably 20 different products flowing through here at any given time. Here in front of me are what we call elevator legs. We have 9 of them here. And what these elevator legs do is they pick up the product that's gone into the basement from the various machines, gone in there by gravity. Then we lift these products up to the top floor and direct them back to the sifters that we saw earlier here. And while this machine is, the leg is not running right now, so we can show this better, what we have here is a belt. And attached to this belt are these cups. And this belt runs this way, picks up the product in the basement with these cups, carries it up to the top floor and into the sifters. So in a flour mill, high ceilings are very important because we rely so much on gravity to go from one process to the next process, and then we end up here again in this elevator system and we elevate the product back upstairs. In the days when this machinery was making flour, all of the flour that left the building left in a bag. Today that's no longer the case. Probably 80% of flour is shipped in bulk. But back in the days of this, when this machinery was making flour, everything was packed. We're looking here at an old flour packer, and this packer can pack 25-pound bags, 50-pound bags, and 100-pound bags. What the operator did, he took a bag and pulled it up here like that, and he'd push the clutch, and it would grind the flour down into the bag. But there was no weighing device in there at those days, so the operator would have to take the bag off this platform after it's gone down, set it on this scale, and weigh it. And if it was a half a pound short or a pound short, he had a bucket here and he'd scoop some flour and put it in the bag, or if there wasn't too much in there, he would take a little bit out and put it in his barrel. So that's how the flour was packed. The bran and the mids, those are the byproducts of a flour mill. They are packed with a machine that's very similar to this. And just for reference, out of a 60-pound bushel of wheat, 75% of it is flour, and the other 25% is half bran and half mids. Both are used for production of animal feed, or in the case of bran, nowadays all of our bran we produce is used in cereal bran production. So this is where it ends up. We have just seen a flour manufacturing setup that is very similar in process to what we do today. However, milling today uses bigger machines, but the basic process of grinding and reducing and sifting is still the same. Prior to the invention of the roller mill, which we just saw, all of your wheat and corn was ground with stones. And this is what we have here. We have a stone where the wheat is introduced here. It's dropped into the center of this stone grinder, and there's another stone that's stationary on the bottom, and the top stone turns, and there's corrugated surfaces on these stones so that we can reduce the wheat or the corn, whatever it might be, to a smaller particle size. And then it works its way out to the end of to the side of the stone and gets collected for processing. In this mill, this particular machine is driven by a water wheel outside the building. And so this takes about 10 horsepower to run this stone. I should point out another feature that Mr. Kern, whom I mentioned earlier, designed and built. And that is this derrick-like device, which is used to lift up the stone for either cleaning or for sharpening of the stone. And you'll notice here the claws that he designed, which can be used to pick up this stone. But I think it's another example of Mr. Kern's very inventive mind to build this here for servicing the stone. Now these stones are no longer used in commercial production of flour to any extent. It's interesting to note, I think, that there's only a few places on this globe where the stone is available to be mined that has the consistency and the strength and the ability to withstand the abrasive grinding action. There's very few places, and most of these stones came from the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of France. I'm not sure if this one came from there, but that's where a lot of them came from. We're now in the basement of the mill, and we're looking here at the line shafting. We have one big motor down here that does a lot of the driving of the machinery, and we do that through line shafting as opposed to having separate motors on each machine. It's much more power efficient to have just one motor than many motors. So what you see here is a line shaft with a series of pulleys, and we drive the roll stands on the main floor from this line shaft. All of them get driven from this one shaft, as well as the packer and a few other small machines. So this is where we produce the energy and transfer it into the machines. Up in here now, we mentioned earlier that we drive our stone with a water wheel. And up in here is the shaft that comes in from the water wheel out by the river, and it comes in here through this set of gears and drives the stone that we saw on the main floor. After the product leaves the stone on the main floor, it comes over here onto this sifter, and we sift the coarse material out, and we save the fine material that we set out to produce. Also, while we're here, back in those days, most of your pulleys were wood pulleys. This is an old craft that is not practiced anymore, but they were very, very good, and they lasted for many, many years. And just another example of some of the equipment that was used back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Wooden pulley. There are many interesting examples in this mill of how technology has changed over the years from how they were back in the 1800s, early 1900s. And here's a good example of it. Back in those days, we didn't have roller bearings and ball bearings, and so we had Babbitt bearings. And what we see here is truly Babbitt bearings. And what we have is the shafts are actually turning not on bearings, but rubbing right on the Babbitt. Babbitt is a combination of lead and something else. Well, it's important that we keep oil in here so that the bearings are always oiled. But that's an interesting change. One of the things we learned is that you pick up around 10% power efficiency going from Babbitt bearings to roller bearings.
Now, can you explain how they make the Babbitt bearings while pouring the...
It's an interesting craft. There's only several people that I still know how to pour Babbitt bearings. But if this bearing wears out, which it finally will, you take this top off here, the bottom half stays in place. You can see the seam here. Then you have to form the top, and you heat up this Babbitt so that it becomes a semi-liquid. And you pour it in the top here into these holes, and then that forms the bearing. And then after it cools off, you can slip the shaft back in,
and you're back in business.